the most important understanding in the book is that observation is your superpower as an urbanist. If we look around at the world and we look at what works and we learn to repeat it or to adapt it and repeat it, there's no stopping us. That once you have an understanding of examples, you can adjust and you can incorporate, you can combine, and there are myriad ways to make streets. And so that's at odds with something that happened um, uh, in the 20th century that I'm going to talk about. So if you go look at our streets, we find that we have streets primarily in the book where that are characterizable as streets where people want to be. You know, the streets that people go back to, and from Brooklyn to Bologna, the building to street relationships, the special experiences that people have in good streets um, are identifiable and replicable. They vary by place. Every time we go to a new place, you get to add to that toolkit of what works. This is Cortona in Italy, for example. So every time we go, we get a new picture or a new example of a way of making a street. Now, here's the at odds part. That is completely contradicted by something that happened about 80 years ago when the transportation experts, the traffic engineers, and their partners developed this very, very limited menu of one size fits all street types. And you've heard them, the local, the collector, and the arterial, the freeway. But essentially three types: local, arterial, collector, local, collector, arterial. And many cities and counties and departments of transportation have just one thin manual with three pictures in it. Here's how we do a local. Here's how we do a collector. Here's how we do an arterial. Turns out that's a very limiting menu. And so the limited menu that we see, here's an example of what um, the the local collector and arterial look like. This one's from El Paso. Here's one from Florida. Um, and so you know what they look like. These streets that are the standard one size fits all designs, they are designed around one basic conclusion, which is that every trip will be made by driving, probably long distances by someone driving alone, everything, every time, every day. Um, and of course, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, which results in the world being really disfigured. If you take that to its logical extreme, in an attempt to keep the traffic moving, people build outlandishly expensive hardware, uh, and not just the freeway system and its interchanges, which of course are amazing feats of engineering that also displace enormous amounts of land and tear through cities in rather violent ways. But also the fact that this ends up isolating us, isolating our cars. And so a theme that I want to hype on here a lot today is about creating value through for all, for the private owners of adjacent land, for the whole of government, for the community as a whole, creating value through the transportation investments that are made in street design. That's the streets and the buildings that face them are the proof to the idea that all development, pause for emphasis, repeat, all development is a public-private partnership. And ultimately, most important one, part of that public-private partnership is the streets tend to be provided by the public or designed according to public standards, and then the private development faces them and completes the puzzle. Well, if that development is going to be in a form that proves reusable, recyclable, enduring, and attractive to make it a place where people want to be, and where they're willing to spend money for it on their rent or on whatever they're putting into your cash register, uh, if that's the way it's done, then you've created an address that has staying power, which translates into property tax revenue, sales tax revenue, and prosperity generally, but especially the tax base strength that is the key to government making things go. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So I also think that we have to, as urbanists, constantly remind ourselves that we're in the before and after business, that our job is to restore confidence that change and growth in the built environment will actually make things better rather than worse. That's, of course, backwards of the way many Americans think about it. been conditioned to expect that change and growth will make things worse rather than better. Um, Not just because they dislike the way it looks, but because they dislike being stuck in traffic generated by the new development, or they're angry about the isolation and loss that's created by the constant conversion of places that we might have loved into places we love less. Now, if we can rethink that and turn it around and make through street design and architecture and real estate development, make places that boost your confidence in growth and change, we will accomplish basically the fundamental need of the 21st century. Well, one definitional thing I want to do is as we talk about street design, like the cover of the book, when we use the term, we mean the whole thing, building face to building face, the buildings, the landscape, the walking area, the bike facility, if there is one, where you drive, where you park, where you load, um, what's going on in the adjacent properties, how it's lit at night, everything about what your experience is like, which has a lot to do with architecture and engineering. So we're using street design to mean the whole thing, not necessarily just the public right of way, although many times the public realm starts at the edge of the public property, but the whole ensemble. And it's very difficult to just for one group in their silo to do their part without coordination with the others and generate one of those places where people want to be. Now, that applies to a lot of the half-built places around our country that we know we're going to have to evolve to build our way out of our problems. Turns out some of our streets could be great assets. Right now, they feel like a drag. And actually, we could build our way toward reversing that. So, if you buy this idea that value creation is the end that without which we can't move forward, it's probably because you've realized that unless the change generates return on investment, unless the change generates value on adjacent properties, you can't get it done. So this is a very business-like way of looking at it. It's not the only way to look at it. We could put it on a different set of lenses and see this the way a biologist would see habitat. We could put on another set of lenses and look at it the way an artist sees the city as a great collective work of art, never finished, which it certainly is. We could look at it like economists. But right, what I'm suggesting is that we look at it through this business lens. And part of the reason I'm suggesting that is because this has appeal across the political spectrum. It's something that a hard-nosed fiscal conservative can understand, and it's also something that somebody who's looking at the benefit to society as a whole, or not as worried about business success, they can still see that if you want to put a new roof on City Hall, or you want to put new tires on school buses, or you want to have a great parks program, you need to generate value in the property taxes and sales taxes that make those things happen. Um, and that's done by making great public spaces, the great addresses to which people want to add buildings. So what do we think about? What's on our mind? First, we think about what kind of experience you're going to have in that place. You step off your stoop. What's that going to be like? Where are you going to go? You're going to like the way it is to get there. We think of the streets as communications media that send messages about what's important to the society that built this place. Um, you might send a message of welcome, or you might inadvertently send the opposite message, for example. We think a lot about what it's like to be the pedestrian or the little kid or a person on a bike in that space. Pedestrians are a little bit like the canary in the coal mine. They're an indicator species. Um, and generally, if we make things great for pedestrians, make it safe, make them comfortable and what have you, and work our way out from that to make a great place for every other purpose, for driving, for deliveries, for moving vans, and for garbage trucks, and for retail, and for housing affordability and abundance. All those things will kind of extend out once you start with the pedestrian. If you start with the cars, if you start in the center line in the middle of the right of way, you start trying to design your way from the center out, and you start with cars and say, well, how many lanes does the math say we might someday want under a ultra cautious scenario generated by a thoroughly discredited computer program to keep our level of service in this many lanes, going through those intersections. And then you'll come back and say, I'm sorry, ma'am, there's no room for street trees. I'm really sorry, Mayor, but we have to have these skinny little sidewalks because the computer made me do it. So start with the pedestrians. That's one of the things on our minds. And then we can accommodate all the other things. We think about transit. In this example, which is St. Charles Avenue in New Orleans, they built a transit facility, but of course, what they also built was an amazing linear park and a great address where people want to be, much more than a transportation facility. You may notice the little worn out areas between the tracks. Um, Runners and people on fat tire bikes are always using this as their exercise facility. And so the runners run along adjacent to the tracks. And then they hear the little bell and they step out of the way, and the St. Charles streetcar goes by. And 17 seconds later, they start their run again. So they didn't just build a transportation facility. They built a wellness facility. They built a place that was actually encouraging the neighbors who live along it to live active daily lives. We think about where this is. Context is all important. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And so that leads us to all kinds of streets, skinny streets, and like this one where the street is really identifiable as a public room. Look at what my hands are doing. It's all about the U, as we say at the University of Miami. But really what I'm describing is the building height to street width proportion. And when that proportion is relatively tight, like 2 to 1, 1 to 1, then you get a high degree of spatial enclosure and tends to make it into a place where humans feel very comfortable and happy to be there. And as that proportion starts to spread wider and wider, since the place goes down, and so does the property value. That street didn't always look so green, by the way. Here's how it looked when it was first installed, and the trees weren't there, and it was open to traffic all the time. Now it's only open to traffic now and then. All right, so here's the only pop quiz in my presentation, Hugh. Anybody in the room there at the watch party want to name that street?
No
Hearing no
takers.
votes, I'll tell you, it's in Rome. This is the Via Appia, the Appian Way. The Romans were amazing street builders, right? But and they did things like standardize chariot wheel widths so that the ruts were consistent, and they standardized the way of making the road bed so that they could always get an army or a message down that street, no matter the weather. Um, I think it's significant that when the Romans were building their roads, the words communications and transportation were synonyms. Uh, if you wanted to send a message, it had to go down the route, not like we do it now with the little fondle slabs in our pockets. So we've inherited, as human beings, after 3,500 years of experience, all kinds of examples, just skinny streets and wide streets and green streets and dark streets and bright streets and streets with most of the pedestrian space in the middle rather than the edges, streets that end, streets that are continuous, streets that are framed, um, and streets that are terminated with drama. And so the compositional task for the civic artist is to think about how to make a street send a message of confidence that makes human beings want to be in that place. So in urban design, many times this is referred to as the public realm, all the spaces between buildings, not just the quantities and types of uses inside buildings, the quantities of space in buildings, but the qualities of the public realm are incredibly important. That space between the buildings. And so much of our American exterior scene outside buildings looks kind of like this. If we go to more mature cities, what we discover is that the public realm feels really strong. This is actually just a fairly average street in Paris. It's not a particularly special one in terms of its design. For by Parisian standards, those are pretty workaday buildings. The ground plane is just asphalt and concrete and stones, no big deal. And yet people come back here consistently over and over to spend their money and to be with other people and to watch other people. So the public realm idea also translates into your experience down on the streets of the quiet, leafy residential street. Um, for example, just compare the public realm here in Port Royal, South Carolina. That's not, by the way, it's not historic development, that's recent development. To the next one, which is in the Midwest. It's In the second example, the public realm has, it feels a little impoverished, right? But it's because we've turned our backs on it. Instead of facing it with front porches and balconies and storefronts and doors and windows, we've faced it instead with this kind of shrine to our vehicles. The investments in infrastructure are really sensitive. So I love Alex McLean's book or books. He has got amazing aerial photographs and ways of visualizing density. This comparison from Vermont has Burlington on the left, and look at what 2,000 feet of gold-plated, taxpayer-funded infrastructure provides for. In that part of Burlington, you can do all kinds of things. It's called Church Street. Can you guess why? Look at the end of it on the top of the picture. But you can go to the church, or you can go to the library, you can go to stores, you can go to housing, you can go to hotels, you can go to City Hall. You can do all these daily social and economic exchanges that we expect people to make in cities. And the one on the right, which is really not that far away in the burbs, we see something quite different. Here's another couple thousand square linear feet of gold-plated infrastructure, and now what we see is some of the buildings poking out of parking lots pattern. And here, if you wanted to get a haircut at lunch, you've got to get in your car and drive to do it. And you'll do that on a jammed regional road that's packed with cars of other people trying to do the same thing you're trying to do in the same lane when you're trying to do it. And so the inefficiency of that is amazing. It's also worth noting that the one on the left is generally illegal. There's something in the zoning or something in the transportation manuals that would prevent you from replicating it. And the one on the right is utterly compliant. All the stormwater ponds, like every little Pizza Hut has its own Pizza Hut sized stormwater pond next to it, probably with a chain link fence around it. And everything is completely compliant with all the regulations and the zoning, the minimum parking requirements and the setbacks and the maximum lot coverage and so on. And look at the difference in the value creation of these two scenes at about the same scale. So real estate professionals like brokers know this instinctively. They know about curb appeal. That's the term that they often use. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. What is going to happen is before your prospect goes inside a building and thinks about whether to rent an apartment there or to buy a condo there or to go to a restaurant there or to start a business there, they're going to be outside the building looking at it. They're going to be in the public realm experiencing the street space. And realtors would love to if they could, but they can't legally blindfold their prospects before they're getting them inside the building and talking about the quantity of the commodity square footage. So the public realm matters a lot. To understand what's happened to the public realm in recent years, it's worth looking at some history. Here's just 1908, so just a little over 115 years ago. And you're looking at New York City. This is Broadway, but you're a little south of Times Square. That's the Times Tower in the distance, that where the ball drops on New Year's Eve. And but here we're at Herald Square. It's because the New York Herald was there. That palace on the right, that's the kind of place they used to build for journalists when people looked up to journalism. And then in the middle, what we see is the street when it was doing all kinds of different things. Cable cars ran in Broadway at that time, so the um, the cable cars are out in the center of the street. You also see Model Ts and people and little trucks, and you see horse-drawn carriages and people on bikes, lots of people on foot, even people waiting in the middle of the street for the cable car. All of this combined activity was possible because the difference in speeds and violence of each of the different ways of moving around was relatively small. And the people with horses and with cars were moderating their speed to adapt to driving through um, a pedestrian-dominated environment at a pace that was acceptable to pedestrians. You also notice in this picture that there are no traffic markings or signs or traffic signals or all the paint on the street and all that. None of that stuff is here. Around 1922, the cars sped up a lot. And so, an old Model T might have tapped out at 20 to 22 miles an hour, something like that. But the new cars are getting faster and quieter and more reliable. And people behind the wheel wanted to flow. And so pedestrians were kind of moved to the outside. to look at another spot in Manhattan to make the point. Here's a pair of pictures that originally this was noticed by Aaron Napperstack, and then John Massengill recreated it. The picture on the bottom is Lexington Avenue when the subway line under Lexington Avenue, the busiest subway line in the world, was being constructed. So you can see some planks that were over the sidewalks at that time. And then to the left, you see those beautiful New York brownstones with the stoops and the ornament and the English basements. Um, and so a great percentage of the space from building face to building face was devoted to pedestrians. And then a percentage of the space in the middle was devoted to vehicles and um, horse-drawn uh, carriages and the like moving back and forth. Fast forward to 100 years later, the picture on the top, that's the same exact spot. You can kind of identify if you look closely at the moldings on the corner of the building, you'll in the foreground, you'll notice that it's really the same building. Someone came along and they pushed the pedestrians outward and they expanded the width and number of the lanes available to motorists. These are mostly people commuting into the city or taxis going back and forth. And they filled in those English basements, and then somebody invented a saw capable of slicing off all the beautiful ornament off the front of the building. But in the end, the result, even in our greenest metropolis, the arguably the place that's most pedestrian dominated and most transit supported in the United States, uh, we still have this mismatch between the devotion to vehicles and the space they take versus humans. So there has been progress, I would say. A lot of the standards I complained about with the arterial collector and local and stuff started to be rewritten. And so NACTO has taken this on, CNU and ITE have taken this on. The Florida DOT even took this on, started rewriting their sacred scrolls about how streets should be designed. So all of our transportation agencies now have permission to do things and say yes to things you as a local community might be asking for, where they might have said no in the past because the handbook said they had to say no. Now they often have permission. So you have to get to know those books so you can, probably better than they do, so you can point to the page where the rule says they're allowed to do it. I'm going to show you a little example. This is a main street. This is in West Palm Beach, Florida. Clematis Street was the main street, runs east-west through the heart of the town. And even when they were just sort of barely begun, and the street was still dirt, the buildings were already beginning to have an urban building to street relationship, sitting upright, sitting forward, multi-story to get that spatial enclosure, running parapets up a little extra high if there was a shorter building in order to make sure it felt like a city. And so this is what it was like when it was dominated by horse-drawn carriages. Fast forward to just a few years later, here's what it looked like after they made it into fundamentally car space. And it kept getting worse. They at one point made it entirely one way. And so Clematis Street, the motoring area and the car storage area, the carriageways and the parking spaces got bigger and more plentiful and wider. And the remaining space for pedestrians got smaller and smaller. Eventually, they came back and they made it a two-way street and they made it two lanes, one in each direction. But the sidewalks were still really skinny, and there just wasn't room for all the things that a revitalized Clematis Street needed, like outdoor dining and shade. So we kind of took this on and we worked up a scenario for making that last group of changes, getting the lanes the right size, and adding trees at the expense of some of the parking spaces in order to get the shade that in the subtropics that's desperately needed, and in order to get the traffic speeds down so that this was a place that could be shared. And so here's on your screen coming up is what Clematis Street looks like now, still one lane in each direction, and but the sidewalks are much wider and there's a lot more tree space. And this was interesting. We started this off with one block as a demonstration and test of the fundamental concept, and then later expanded it to 6 block faces and altogether. And sometimes they close the street to traffic for their events, but the aerial view shows how much less of the space is now devoted to moving and stored cars versus how much is devoted to landscape and to people space. Um, Look down from a high parapet shows a cyclist um, fearlessly riding on the wrong side of the road because the cars are moving slowly here on this super narrow street, and he can easily make adjustments and he can see everything going on around him. It's a really kind of a bike-paced street. When they close it to traffic, it becomes even more magical. This is a city that's lucky to have a growing downtown population, so they bring people out in the street on a regular basis. And these are some images of the way Clematis Street looks now. I want to show you a tiny little clip, and it may not smoothly stream, so I'll let it run um, to see if it smooths out. But we made a discovery. The landscape architect, Jonathan Haig, who worked with us on this, found out that the fixed bollards were only about $300 cheaper than the retractable ones. And so it's a minor upgrade. So by the time we got to the later phases of this, we we used the retractable bollards and we put them on either side of a parking space along the curbless, skinny, shadier street. And now within a few seconds, the city can convert a parking space to an outdoor dining space or a vending space or seating area. And so that was an example about thinking through how streets might be adaptable. And then they, emboldened by the way that worked, they went on to create a manual for West Palm Beach that applies to many of their streets on how closures, partial closures, adaptable parking spaces, and so on will work. During COVID, a lot of the businesses had to come out of the insides of buildings, remember? And they came out into the street where they could. And we even saw on the curbless Clematis Street, the cycle gym moving its uh, exercise bikes out into the street for spin class. So what I'm getting at is that the manuals have changed, and we can say yes to things like skinny lanes and curbless streets and slow design speeds in the past were difficult. And that means we can get back in touch with all the different kinds of streets in our world, like the streets where they tell you what season it is. This is where you look outside to know what time of day it is, you know, where you are by the landmarks. Um, and it puts us back in touch with the possibilities of streets. Now, there's a thing in the U.S. Constitution called the police power. If you haven't heard about it before, they teach you this in planning school. It's that phrase you've probably heard that says, "We shall enact such laws as necessary to protect the public health, safety, and welfare." And this is the police power clause. It's essentially the basis for zoning and for regulation, the Clean Water Act, and for traffic laws and for street design manuals. So I look at this fellow who's sitting here and I'm asking, how are we doing on protecting his public health, safety, and welfare? You see, he looks kind of miserable. It's a hot day. Um, I broke the rules, took his picture first and then asked him if it was okay. I should have done that the other way around. You're supposed to ask first. But after I took the picture and I turned to him and I said, "Good morning. Do you mind if I take your picture?" He turned to me and a big grin came across his face. He was so happy to be acknowledged by somebody else. Um, but let's talk about more than his the way he felt in that space. Our friend of New Urbanism, Dr. Dick Jackson, who wrote a book about uh, the city and public health, would look at this guy and he will say that this fellow will eventually end up in an emergency room. In that emergency room, somebody's going to diagnose him. They're going to determine that he has dehydration or heat stroke or something like that. But what he really has is street tree deficiency syndrome. He's suffering from a really bad case of poor bus stop design. And so the public realm is failing him and is failing everybody. We put our healthcare workers at risk to their health just to get back and forth from home to work during a shift change. At this point, I think it's important to say that we realize that there's not one way of designing streets that has to apply every single time, everywhere. Context matters a lot. And by this point in a presentation like this one, people will usually say, but wait, Victor, hold on here. We're not Amsterdam. And to that, I have to answer, neither was Amsterdam. Amsterdam wasn't always Amsterdam. In the middle of the 20th century, they were going hard toward the American model of happy motoring, and their streets were beginning to be clogged with cars and parking lots and took over their public spaces. And children were being killed in the streets, which led to something of a citizen revolt. And they made it a societal objective to gradually reduce the presence and dominance of cars in their lives. And so the Amsterdam we have now is because of that. And when I show pictures of New York and what they've accomplished, I get the same thing. We're not New Amsterdam. And New York wasn't always the New York you know now either. Here's the space in front of Madison Square Park, where the Flatiron Building, Daniel Burnham's famous building, is located. And a few years ago, they came out in the middle of the night and they dropped boulders in the street and they put in potted plants and painted some colors and turned car space into pedestrian space. I would say if they can do it in New York with all of their capacity for arguing with one another, I bet you can do it in Salt Lake City. When we look at the streets that routinely show up as Americans' favorite main streets, they have a few things in common. I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of those are. Here's an example, Main Street in Galena, Illinois, but here's a very different example, a street by John Nolan's design in Charlotte, North Carolina. These look entirely different, and yet they're both reasonable uh, responses to their contexts. So we have main streets, we have skinny streets like the tiny streets in Society Hill in Philadelphia. We have step streets, have narrow passages. We have those paseos or passageways that lead between, through the middle of blocks. We have canal streets. We have wide streets, including proud streets like Commonwealth Avenue in Boston or Oglethorpe Avenue, and lots of wide streets in Salt Lake City. Part of your story, part of your history is that the streets were broad, partly for practical reasons, but partly to send a message that this was a proud and stable society being formed. I'm going to give you five things to ask for when they're designing a street or redesigning a street in your town. The streets where people want to be always have these five things. First, they're shaped. They feel like a public room, as I described before. They're comfortable, and that's especially important with the swings of climate across seasons. They tend to be connected to the rest of the surrounding scene. They are safe and they're memorable. So I'll give you examples on each of those. But when we get all those things right in one place, we create a street that adds so much value. It would be unthinkable not to keep it or reuse it as it is. Let's look at shape first. Here's a little diagram that shows that building height to street width proportional idea. And you can see that now that you've seen this, you'll never be able to unsee it. Um, but that relatively tight proportion of height to width is what makes it comfortable to humans based on the physiognomy of the human eye. And we all expect that or take that for granted in downtowns. Like here's downtown Portland, where the tall buildings frame the street on both sides. Okay, you're used to that. But it also applies in small towns and in the suburbs and in more tranquil places, out of the way places even where the buildings are only 1 or 2 stories tall. And that extra ceiling height, that extra little bit of parapet, or that second story ends up doing so much to frame the street space that you know there's a there when you arrive there. And so in redevelopment and in revitalizing communities, we always look at where there's a possibility to recapture lost space along these streets and use it to improve that frame of spatial enclosure. And then the space between the buildings can be optimized for all the different users. Number two is comfortable. In a place where we have deciduous trees that lose their leaves in the winter, that means that in the summertime, you're getting a dappled sunlight on the sidewalks and they're lowering the cooling cost inside these buildings because they're making it easier to keep the air conditioner, keep it cool because of shade. They make you comfortable walking on the sidewalk. In the winter, when the sun is lower and they've lost their leaves, They let the sun in to warm these buildings and melt the ice on these sidewalks and lower the heating costs. And so that comfort factor is something that we kind of expect in places where there's lots of water and people grow lots of trees. But in drier places and in hot, sticky climates and in high altitude climates, it's also possible to use the architecture to create the same sense of comfort or protection from the elements, whether it's the glare from the summer sun or whatever kind of precipitation is falling on you from overhead. Comfort also means being comfortable that you can just be in that space and you're not worried all the time about something happening, like a car bumping into you. This is a scene in London. These fellows are having a conversation on the sidewalk. One of them has his heels about 8 or 9 inches from the curb, but he's not at all worried about that because if you notice, the sidewalk reaches the crosswalk and then continues level across the street intersection. And so the cars entering that little street have to go up and over the crosswalk and back down again. This is a very busy part of London with cars swirling all around. This is the area where the BBC has their headquarters. And yet that little detail makes these guys comfortable exchanging an idea or talking about what they're going to do after lunch. Um, and the little detail that matters a lot for comfort is, of course, the street tree line. And I put this here because I want to tell you about speaking to the lady in the green sweater who's seen in the distance. And she didn't know we had designed the neighborhood, but I was just walking around taking pictures. I saw her there, and so I asked her what she thought about her neighborhood. And without any prompting, she pointed to the trees and she said, "Those trees are my lifeline. Because those trees are there, I come out of my townhouse and I walk around my block and I get exercise every day. And I walk by my neighbors' porches and I know all my neighbors' kids' names and they know my name. And sometimes they are sitting on the porch and they'll ask me to help them with their homework." And she went on and on about how her daily life was affected. And she said, "Without those trees, I'd never get out of my house." So simple detail like planting trees might matter a lot. We have a lot of trees in the place where our office is located, a city called Coral Gables, but we didn't always have those trees. When it was first constructed, it was almost completely treeless, and they went in small, and then they grew. And so investment in trees, it matters. I would also say sticking to your guns when somebody tells you that all the car space and all the fire department stuff and all the garbage truck stuff and all the manuals mean that you can't have street trees or the budget doesn't support it. I would say keep pushing. They always tell you no 6 times and then they say yes the seventh time. Don't underestimate the power of even a single tree, a lean-in tree written about by Raymond Unwin, for example. Third on my list is connectedness. The streets where people want to be are connected. So if you have only one way to go from here to there, everybody has to use it, right? But if you start to create the elementary beginnings of a grid and have parallel streets, you get new ways to go from A to B. Um, this shows how just a 2 by 2 grid has 6 ways to go. And then the math is that as you get more small blocks and more intersections, then there are more and more routes. 4 by 3 is 35. An 8 by 8 grid gives you 12,870 ways to go from here to there. So connectedness is hugely valuable, and of course means that not everybody is having to use the same intersection or the same lane you're using when you're using it. Walter Kulash famously said that two-lane roads carry a lot more traffic than one 4-lane road. Let that sink in for a second. So if we have lots of streets, we can demote some of them. We can make some of them really slow or really skinny or really small. And that's, of course, what they've done in this street that Peter Swift helped design. It's what they've done historically in older cities like Charleston. I want to acknowledge while we love the skinny streets, that there are also always going to be a call for some streets to be big. And while narrow is best, wide streets can be terrific. This is the Avinguda Diagonal in Barcelona, which carries way more traffic than any street in your region. And and yet it's a great address. People want to be there. All kinds of businesses are there. All sorts of life happens there. It's not just car space. Using Barcelona example, well, I'll always get this. Uh, we have what we have in Barcelona because people drew lines on a map and said, that's the town we want to be when we grow up. And then they went and built it. So let's talk about safety. Number 4. A little uptick in speed means a huge increase in mayhem when there's a collision. Uh, and so modern cars, very quiet, very sealed, very comfortable. It's very easy to go faster. And if the signals you're getting through your brain, through your eyeballs, through the windshield are go ahead and press the accelerator, you might as well. There's no harm in it. Then you're going to speed up from 20 to 40 without even thinking about it. And of course, the danger multiplies really fast. So I look at streets where there's a tight little turning radius at the corner, or even a tree planted close to the corner, and I realize they are also sending a message saying, slow the heck down. There are kids living here. There are old people living here, and you might be related to some of them. And wouldn't it be great if they could stay alive? So small is beautiful, slow is beautiful. Slowing cars down might sound like a threat to the need for moving, the need for flow. Every engineer knows about this diagram called the speed flow capacity diagram. And it's kind of logical. It says as you go faster, a little bit faster and a little bit faster, you get more cars through a lane of traffic per hour. Okay. Or you get more water through a pipe. Same idea. But there is a point right around 26, 27 miles an hour when that reverses and ceases to be the case. And even as you increase the speed, you get fewer cars through. So it really doesn't help to try and get everybody going 45 miles an hour. They're just going to accelerate to the taillights of the next person who stops in front of them. So the streets where people want to be seem to have this slow factor built in, like Seven Dials, which Hank Dittmar wrote about in our book, is a place where people go out onto the monument and sit there on the bench and watch the parade of life go on all around them. So, can we do this? Is it sensible? Is it constitutional to reconsider how we use this public space? I would argue the police power says yes. By the way, traffic engineers will talk about something they call alternate modes of transportation. Um, well, walking and biking are not alternate modes. They're the original modes. Um, and so as we think about walking and biking and transit, you should think about how much space these things take for the same number of people to move through a city. Um, the amount of space that it takes to keep the cars moving in their lanes is bad enough, but since the cars are sitting motionless, parked 94 or 96% of the time, it's even worse. And so just remember walking and biking are the original modes. When I talk to American audiences, I always ask if there are car trips they're making now they'd rather make by walking or biking, and they almost always say yes, but only if we make it safe out there. So it can't be terrifying to cross the street or to use the street on your bike. Many cities, including yours, have experimented with ways of making intersections and streets that have dedicated places to ride, for example, that feel safe, like protected bike lanes. Not something you would have to do on every street or want to do in every case, but a great medicine to have in your medicine bag, used with the correct dosages. Use only as directed. But we do see many cities, especially in the mature European capitals, taking back space within their right of way to make that possible. And it's not a monolithic population. I mean, some people are exercisers, some people are on their way home from work, some people are just moving slowly on a leisure ride, others are going to school. They're of different ages and different sizes and different speeds. And so we want to think of them as varied as our population is. But then by this point, there have been enough new interventions in public spaces and enough different configurations and experiments with ways of doing bike lanes, for example, that we don't have to invent this from scratch. We kind of know how to do it, and so the thing is to just give ourselves permission to do it. Like imagine how we might repurpose some of all that asphalt, for example. This intervention doesn't do any harm to the flow and happiness of motorists, but it does a lot to improve the safety for everybody else, and probably to improve the greenness and the quality of the neighborhood. So I don't usually use the term complete streets very much. John and I criticize it in our book actually as a great bumper sticker, but when somebody just paints paint on the side of the road, is it really complete? No. Unless it's a beautiful street, it's not yet a complete street, and one that sends the message of a place where people belong. Repurposing right of way can mean you can get your transit moving without being stuck in traffic. That's certainly been done. And and it can mean we can share spaces. Many times moving the above the curb cycle track into relation with the sidewalk is better than leaving the bikes out among the cars. And Dutch have invented other kinds of streets like so-called bike priority street or fietsstraat, where there are cars, but they have to operate at a bike pace, which is pretty powerful. There's a little sticker they put on the streets that says in Dutch, "Auto de gast," which means your car is a guest. Um, the documentation is there. We have an epidemic of a public safety crisis, really. 44,000 people a year uh, killed in the United States in traffic, an ever larger percentage of them pedestrians and people on bikes. So it actually has to be something we take action on. Angie Schmidt, who wrote a terrific book about this, says driving should be a privilege, walking should be a right, but somehow we've gotten that backwards. So when I look at places like Madison Square, I realize the humans knew exactly what to do when the temporary tables and chairs came out on what was just the day before swirling with yellow taxis. They sat down, they knew how to use public space. The last and most elusive category of my five things is that it ought to be memorable, that we ought to have an experience that makes us want to go back there and do that again. This is especially crucial in a tourism-driven economy, but I think it matters everywhere. That the memorable places are the places where human creativity is on display. We like to people watch. We like to look at the things people make. So that might be architecture. It might be art, official or unofficial. It might be signs. It might be sounds, colors, and smells and music. But the human creativity is on display. And that tends to create places where people want to pull out their phone and make their Instagram picture. It also is true in everyday situations, not the fancy art installations, but just a beautiful storefront for an ordinary bakery or an old building that gets repurposed over and over in its time. And here's an example from China of a street that's certainly memorable. That's the Nanjing Road in Shanghai, and there they do it with color and light and signs. You could add yourself, if you really wanted to, a great accessory like an Arc de Triomphe sitting at the end of your streets. Not bad. But what we're really looking at when you look at the Avenue Dienna is the most beautiful parking lot in the world because there is an enormous amount of parking happening on both sides of those tree lines up and down the street. And yeah, we don't think of it as a parking lot. We think of it as a beautiful and monumental avenue. And that pattern repeats itself in all sorts of contexts over and over and over, like facing like, making the street like a public room, thinking about how it might change during the day. If you've been to the Rue Saint-Jean in Quebec, during the day, there's cars going back and forth in the middle of the road. And but as twilight arrives, the restaurants reassemble their outdoor dining areas on the sidewalk. French barricade comes out, and the violinist follows him out into the middle of the street and starts. And then the center of the street becomes the walking space. So there's a street that actually changes from day to day or from week to week. I'm often asked about how we can make places car optional. Car optional neighborhood is like a clothing optional beach. You don't have to wear one. You can wear one if you want to. Um, and if you look at my short list here of the things that make a place car optional, what you'll discover is that you don't get to technology until like number seven, and it's the only one that's really technological. That all the rest of the things have to do with just basic daily street design. So we're going to need a bigger menu. That means we had to go back and rewrite our book. So now we have a thing we call the catalog of essential street types, and this this is animated on the street.design website. You can go look at that. But each of the street types, whether it's a little village street or a great multi-way avenue, is illustrated so you can understand its fundamental parts. Like the Canal Street I talked about before, that was based on one we built for real in the South Carolina Low Country here, and became a very prestigious address where people kept one-upping each other on the architecture and grandeur of their homes. We need streets like that Canal Street that have been lost from the menu. And there are others, Market Streets, for example. How about this, the classic American Garden Street with a tree line and uh, dooryards or front yards? So the catalog of essential street types is a new feature in the street design book. I hope you'll find it useful. We end that with one of the greenest types, parkways and drives. A drive, according to lexicon, means that there's a park or waterfront on one side and the buildings of the city on the other. The most famous example being Riverside Drive in New York. And John Massengale wrote for the book what will, I think, come to be known as the definitive design history of Riverside Drive. So I'm excited to see what you all think about that. We're doing all this for very simple reasons. It's to improve people's lives and unleash them um, to make things and take us to the next step. So uh, with that, I'll stop and say thank you very much and look forward to any questions you might have.
Victor, thank you so much. A lot packed in there. Appreciate your time. For questions, we have several that have come in online, but I want to turn to those folks that were able to make it in person to see if there's anybody that wants to ask a question live.
Victor, thanks for the presentation. Salt Lake City has wide streets. Any comments or suggestions on Salt Lake? I mean, you've been to Salt Lake, and any thoughts,
Yes,
particularly about Salt Lake?
of course. Your inheritance includes those very wide thoroughfares, and it was part of a system that was used throughout the Mountain West to settle hundreds of towns after Salt Lake. So you were the proof of concept town for 600 or so towns that have similar patterns, similar grids, lots of similar setup to them. Um, it was important to make streets wide, I think, in the pioneering times in the American West because we were, mule teams had to turn around in those streets and so that they needed a lot of space for that. But there's also symbolic reason for them to be wide. These are more like the streets in the kingdom of heaven, um, broad and all that. And so I think what that means for you now is that you can look at it and say, you have a big wide canvas. You have a lot of room to work with. Many other communities that are trying to fit everything in they want, like trees or a place to enjoy a meal at a sidewalk cafe, um, or a place to ride your bike safely. Well, they start running into trouble really quickly in skinny streets, finding room for all those things. And your wide streets mean that really is never not going to be your excuse, at least not on the most important thoroughfares. And if you're just devoting more and more of the space to lanes for cars, in a kind of futile chasing after capacity to try and reduce delay, then you're missing out on all the other ways you could use those streets.
Victor, do you have time for one more? I know we're at 1:30.
Sure.
Well, 1:30 our time. Be great.
Thank you, Victor. Soren Simonson here.
Hi,
Really good to
Soren.
see you. Yeah, thanks
It's
so
been a
much for
while.
your time and joining us. So I've got two questions. We may only have time for one, so I'm going to prioritize these. My first question has to do with right turn pockets. I've been advocating for many years that when we're doing some makeovers, and we've had some really good ones in Salt Lake City, but many of them continue to include right turn pockets, which I see as being really in opposition to our complete streets and our bicycle and pedestrian friendly designs. I'd love to hear your thoughts about advocating for eliminating right turn pockets and whether or not they really create traffic snarls if they are eliminated.
Right. Okay, good. Well, yeah, the idea of getting a car in front of you out of the way in case they want to slow down and turn right or wait to turn right so that you can just thunder on through with your car in the lane that they vacated. This is based on the idea that you're worshiping speed, that you think flow is the most important thing. And while flow might matter, and it feels like a natural thing to do in modern cars, flow is not as important as safety. And the right turn pockets are working against safety. They also work against sense of place. They take space that would have been great for landscaping or for the bike share station um, or to make that corner business more successful. They take that space and they just devote it to the occasional use for a few seconds at a time by someone scooting to the right. Now, every time a traffic engineer studies an intersection, they add up all the maneuvers and they will study how many people are turning right or how many aren't. And there may be circumstances where you're going to do it. Remember that we're talking about design, so there are a few absolutes. But in a mature city, in the core of the metropolis, in the downtown, and the part that we want to make most walkable, um, all the turn lanes should be questioned. They might. That's why a lot of communities have realized that the dual lefts are a suburban idea that doesn't belong in their downtown. And same thing for the right turn pockets and for the little slip lanes that are on occasion worked in. So whenever we can, we will draw them out in a redesign, remove them. If that helps. I thought of one last thing while we were talking here um, was the new book on the art of the new urbanism. I don't know if you guys have all seen it, but um, there's I'm going to just share my screen if that's okay. There's a book that we brought out at CNU in Providence um, called The Art of the New Urbanism, which is really a catalog of an exhibition that was held quite some time ago at a previous CNU. And it's full of the drawings that new urbanists have been making. This is mostly focused on the period 1980 to 2010, so the foundational years of the movement. And now we're working on a second volume. So there will be a new exhibition at the CNU in Northwest Arkansas next May with a concentration on work created between 2010 and 2025. We'll have some new stuff from the foundational archives that have since surfaced as well. And there will be a new book with that. And I've discovered, just taking this around with me on charrette, there's an example of almost everything you can think of wanting to draw, like a street or a building or a neighborhood form. Someone is, or what angle to choose for your rendering when you're trying to decide what to stay up late drawing. These are great tools. Although the royalties from the sale of the Art of the New Urbanism books go to the CNU, to the nonprofit organization. So I don't want you to buy one, I want you to buy 150 of them and pass them out to all your friends.
Well, I certainly look forward to the new edition of both of the books you've mentioned during your time with us today, and we really appreciate it. Apologies to everybody that had a question that we're just not able to get to, but hopefully there are additional resources out there that have been pointed to where this can be available to folks. So
Feel free to email me as well.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Victor. Maybe we'll compile some of these questions and shoot them over to you and see if you're willing to respond to them. So really
Absolutely.
appreciate your time. Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.
See you soon.